The heat in Adelaide on January 26, 1966 was not merely a temperature, it was a physical weight that pressed against the skin of every resident. It was Australia Day, a time for backyard cricket and cold drinks, but for the Beaumont children, the only true relief lay in the rolling waves of Glenelg Beach. 9-year-old Jane, a responsible girl with a quiet confidence beyond her years, led the way. Behind her trailed 7-year-old Anna and little Grant, who was just 4, his small feet struggling to keep pace as they walked toward the bus stop. They were the very picture of post-war Australian innocence, dressed in simple swimwear and carrying towels, their skin already beginning to glow under the fierce southern sun. To their mother, Nancy, this was a routine excursion. A 5-minute bus ride to a familiar shore where the salt air mingled with the scent of eucalyptus. She watched them leave with the easy trust of a parent in an era when doors were left unlocked and neighbours were considered family. By the time the trio reached the sand, the beach was already teeming with holiday crowds. The atmosphere was festive, yet amidst the thousands of sunbathers, several witnesses would later recall a specific, jarring sight. Near a public sprinkler used to wash away the salt and sand, the 3 Beaumont children were seen playing happily. But they were not alone. Standing near them was a tall, thin man with blonde hair and an athletic build. To onlookers, he seemed like a friend or perhaps a relative, his presence so casual that it raised no immediate alarms. He watched the children with an intensity that, in hindsight, would become the stuff of nightmares. They were seen laughing as he helped them under the cool spray of the water, a moment of pure summer joy that would soon be frozen in time as the last recorded instance of their happiness. Jane, usually shy around strangers, appeared remarkably comfortable with this mystery figure, sparking a mystery that would endure for generations. As the clock ticked toward noon, the first flickers of unease began to stir in the Beaumont household. The children had been instructed to return on the 12 o'clock bus, a deadline that Jane was usually meticulous about keeping. When the bus hissed to a stop at their corner and the doors folded open to reveal an empty sidewalk, Nancy felt a sharp, icy prickle of worry pierce through the heavy midday heat. She reasoned with herself, thinking perhaps they had simply missed the bus or had stayed for one last dip in the ocean to escape the rising temperature. But as the 1 o'clock bus came and went, and then the 2 o'clock, that slight annoyance transitioned into a heart-stopping, visceral panic. The sun was still high and the day was still bright, but for the Beaumont family, the world was rapidly darkening into an unrecognizable landscape of fear. Jim Beaumont returned home from work to find his wife in a state of frantic agitation. Together they rushed to the shoreline, their voices joining the cacophony of the crowded beach as they called out names that would soon be known by every household in the country. They searched the changing rooms, the kiosks, and the jetty, their eyes scanning the horizon for 3 familiar silhouettes that refused to appear. The local shopkeeper remembered them. They had come in to buy pasties and a meat pie with a pound note, a detail that baffled Nancy, as she had only given them loose change. This suggested the involvement of an adult, a stranger with pockets deep enough to win a child's trust. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The search intensified as the afternoon shadows lengthened across the burning sand. What began as a local concern quickly escalated into a frantic citywide mobilization. The police were called, and soon the bright holiday atmosphere of Glenelg was replaced by the grim determination of search parties and flashlights. As the sun finally dipped below the horizon, casting a blood-red glow over the Gulf St. Vincent, a devastating realization settled over the community like a cold, suffocating fog. The Beaumont children had not just wandered off or stayed too long in the surf. They had been plucked from the heart of a crowded beach, vanishing into the void as if they had never existed at all, leaving behind a silence that would haunt the Australian psyche for decades to come. The era of innocence was over and the nightmare had only just begun. The morning after Australia Day saw Adelaide transform from a sleepy coastal city into a hive of desperate activity. The largest missing persons hunt in Australian history was no longer just a police operation. It was a civilian mobilisation. Thousands of volunteers lined the coast. They combed every sand dune and peered into every storm drain. Divers braved the depths beneath the jetty, each searching for a discarded towel or a bathing suit. Yet, despite the sheer scale of the manhunt, the silence from the landscape was deafening. The police were utterly baffled. There were no struggle marks, no discarded belongings, and no further sightings of the tall, blonde man after noon. It was as if the earth itself had opened up and swallowed Jane, Anna, and Grant whole. At the center of this storm were Jim and Nancy Beaumont, whose lives had effectively ended the moment that bus returned empty. Their modest home on Harding Street became a living monument to that day in 1966. Inside, the world stood still. The children's beds remained neatly made, their toys sat untouched on the shelves, and their school clothes hung in the closets, waiting for bodies that would never return to fill them. Every creak of the floorboards or knock at the door sent a jolt of agonizing hope through Nancy's heart. She refused to move, refused to change the locks, and refused to even redecorate, terrified that if the children somehow found their way home, they wouldn't recognize the house. This was not just grief, it was a state of suspended animation, a shrine built from the bricks of what if. As the months bled into years, the desperation of the investigation began to invite the surreal and the sinister. In a move that highlighted the police's utter lack of tangible leads, they turned to the supernatural. Gerard Croiset, a famous Dutch psychic, was flown into the country, followed by a media circus that treated his arrival like a messianic event. Croiset pointed his finger at a site near the children's home, claiming they were buried under a new concrete floor in a warehouse. The public watched with bated breath as jackhammers tore through the ground, but the excavation yielded nothing but dirt and broken promises. It was a pattern that would repeat for decades. Hope weaponized against two parents who were willing to believe anything if it meant seeing their children again. The Adelaide Oval and various construction sites were torn apart based on whispers and visions, each failure leaving a deeper scar on the Beaumont psyche. Perhaps the most cruel blow came in 1968 when two letters arrived at the Beaumont home. One was purportedly written by Jane, claiming that they were being kept safe by a man who was kind to them. The handwriting seemed hauntingly familiar to a desperate mother's eyes. For a brief, shining moment, it appeared the nightmare was over. Jim and Nancy followed the instructions, traveling to a designated meeting point in the hopes of a reunion. They waited for hours in the cold, their eyes scanning every passing car, every shadow. No one came. It was later revealed through advanced forensic testing that the letters were a heartless hoax. The person responsible had preyed on the most vulnerable people in the country for reasons that remain utterly incomprehensible. Decades passed, and the sun rose and set over Glenelg Beach thousands of times, but the shadows never retreated for Jim and Nancy. They grew old in a house filled with the ghosts of children who never grew up, surrounded by school books and small shoes that remained perpetually new. The case remained open, a festering wound in the Australian consciousness, until a new name emerged from the darkness of the past. Investigations began to swirl around a prominent local businessman, Harry Phipps, whose own son came forward with disturbing memories of his father's behavior and secret excavations at his property. As the 21st century dawned, the focus shifted toward this sinister figure, suggesting that the monster might not have been a wandering stranger, but a man hidden in plain sight. While the Beaumont children remain the most enduring symbols of a modern Australian tragedy, they were not the first to vanish into the realm of the inexplicable along the nation's southern coastline. Nearly 2 decades before the Beaumonts stepped onto that fateful bus, another enigma had washed up on the sands of Adelaide, baffling world-class investigators for 70 years. It began on the morning of December 1st, 1948, as a crisp, salt-tinged breeze swept across Somerton Beach. Early morning strollers noticed a man slumped against the concrete seawall, his legs extended and his head resting against the cold stone. Initially, they thought he was simply sleeping off a long night. But as the sun climbed higher and the figure remained motionless, the realization dawned that this was no ordinary sleeper. The man was dead, but his passing presented a portrait of bizarre perfection. He was middle-aged, well-built, and dressed in a manner entirely out of place for a day at the seaside. He wore a crisp white shirt, a red and blue tie, brown trousers, and a pair of highly polished leather shoes. He was impeccably groomed, with not a single hair out of place on his head. There were no signs of a struggle, and no obvious wounds, and no clear indication of how his life had ended so abruptly. When the police searched his pockets, the mystery only deepened. They found no wallet, no cash, and no identification. Most unsettling was the discovery that every single label had been meticulously removed from his clothing. It was as if someone had gone to extreme lengths to ensure that this man, in death, would have no name and no origin. The autopsy offered more questions than answers. The pathologist noted the man's spleen was 3 times its normal size, and his stomach was congested with blood, suggesting a powerful, fast-acting poison. Yet despite extensive chemical analysis, no trace of any toxic substance could be found. He had died of heart failure, but the cause remained a scientific impossibility. Adding to the surreal scene was a half-burned cigarette resting on the collar of his coat, as if he had simply stopped breathing in a quiet moment of reflection. He was a man who seemingly did not exist. His fingerprints matched no one in the country, and his photograph brought no recognition from government agencies. Investigation shifted to a brown suitcase found at the Adelaide railway station, checked in the day before the discovery. Inside were items mirroring the man on the beach. Clothing with labels removed, shirts with the name Keane, a red herring, and a spool of unusual orange thread. This thread matched stitching in the man's pockets. It was clear he had travelled and carefully curated his anonymity before reaching his final destination. The breakthrough came months later during a final examination of the man's trousers. Deep within a secret fob pocket, investigators found a tiny rolled-up scrap of paper. On it were 2 words in Persian script, Tamam Shud. Translated, it means, "It is finished." It was torn from the final page of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, a 12th century collection of Persian poetry. This discovery transformed a local death into an international puzzle. The phrase was not just a message, it was a ritualistic finality that hinted at a life far more complex than that of a common traveller. The search for the book led police to a copy found in the backseat of a car parked near the shore. On the back cover were faint pencil markings, 5 lines of capital letters that appeared to be a complex code. Beneath this cipher was a telephone number belonging to a nurse named Jo Thompson, known as Jestin. When police eventually confronted her with a plaster cast of the man's face, her reaction was visceral, a recoil that spoke of secrets deeper than a simple acquaintance. This gentleman on Somerton Beach was no longer just a nameless corpse. He was a bridge to a world of shadows, spies, and a forbidden connection beginning to surface. The moment Jo Thompson, the nurse known as Jestin, laid eyes on the plaster death mask of the man from Somerton Beach, the room seemed to lose its air. She did not just look at it, she recoiled, her body manifesting a physical rejection of the image before her. Police officers present noted that she appeared on the verge of fainting, her eyes darting away from the cold, white features of the man she claimed she did not recognize. Despite her visceral reaction, she remained steadfast in her denial. She told the detectives that while she had once owned a copy of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, she had given it to an army lieutenant named Alf Boxall during the war. It seemed a neat explanation until the police tracked down Boxall, who was very much alive and still in possession of his book, the final page perfectly intact. The lie was exposed, but Jo Thompson took her secrets to her grave, leaving behind a legacy of silence that would haunt the investigation for generations. This confrontation solidified the belief that the Somerton Man was no accidental traveller. The atmosphere of 1948 was thick with the paranoia of the early Cold War, and the man's impeccable anonymity, the removed labels, the lack of identification, and the sophisticated Tamam Shud scrap pointed toward a life lived in the shadows. The most baffling piece of evidence remained the 5 lines of capital letters penciled into the back of the book found near the beach. For decades, the world's most elite codebreakers, from naval intelligence to amateur cryptographers, threw themselves at the cipher. It was a jumble of letters like MRGOABABD and MTBIMPANETP. Some struck out with a single line. Some saw it as a complex cryptographic key for a one-time pad, the preferred method of Soviet intelligence. Others argued it was a mnemonic for a poem or a desperate scrambled message written in a dying moment. The code became a symbol of the man himself, an unbreakable puzzle that refused to be solved by logic alone. As the years turned into decades, a more personal mystery began to emerge, centered on Jo Thompson's own family. Investigators noticed a striking physical resemblance between the Somerton Man and Jo's son, Robin. Both shared rare genetic anomalies, a specific shape of the upper ear known as the Simba, and a condition called hypodontia, where certain teeth are naturally missing. The statistical probability of these 2 men sharing such rare traits by chance was astronomical. It suggested a forbidden romance, a child born of a secret affair, and perhaps a man who travelled across the country not for espionage, but to see a son he could never claim. The betrayal was not just political. It was deeply human, buried under layers of social propriety and the silence of a woman who had too much to lose. The 21st century brought a technological hammer to this wall of silence. In 2021, after years of legal battles and relentless advocacy by researchers like Professor Derek Abbott, the Australian government finally granted permission to exhume the body. The man who had been buried under a simple headstone labelled the Unknown Man was brought back into the light. The process was painstaking, a race against the degradation of time. Forensic scientists turned their attention not just to the bones, but to a few precious strands of hair that had been trapped in the plaster of the death mask 7 decades earlier. Using the burgeoning science of genetic genealogy, the same technology used to catch serial killers, they began to trace the man's lineage through thousands of distant cousins. The breakthrough was as sudden as it was quiet. The name was no longer a cipher, it was Carl Webb. He was not a high-level Soviet operative or a romantic ghost, but a 43-year-old electrical engineer and instrument maker from Melbourne. Records showed he had been a man of quiet habits who liked poetry and horse racing, a man whose marriage had collapsed shortly before his disappearance. His wife, Dorothy, had even filed for divorce, citing his departure as desertion. The identification was a triumph of science, but it served to deepen the mystery of his final hours. The reveal of a mundane identity only made the circumstances of his death more surreal. Why would a Melbourne engineer travel to Adelaide, scrub his identity from his clothes, and carry a secret code into the afterlife? The name Carl Webb was a label, but it was not an answer. It left the world wondering what drove a common man to orchestrate a death so profoundly enigmatic that it remained a masterpiece of mystery for 70 years. While the Somerton Beach mystery finally had a name, other shores in Australia were about to be stained by crimes that were far more brutal and visceral in their execution. The transition from the intellectual puzzle of Carl Webb to the raw, visceral terror of the mid-60s marks a dark turning point in the Australian psyche. While the Somerton Man whispered of secrets, the events of January 11, 1965, screamed with a brutality the nation was unprepared for. On that humid Monday, Marianne Schmidt and Christine Sharrock set out for a day at Cronulla. They were the picture of youth, full of laughter and summer dreams. Marianne, a German immigrant, found in Christine a kindred spirit. The girls shared secrets and sandwiches, enjoying the simplicity of their bond. They sought freedom on the coast, unaware they were walking into a landscape that would soon become a nightmare. The air hung heavy with the scent of salt, the promise of an approaching storm. The girls arrived at Wanda Beach, known for its towering, shifting sand dunes and deep isolation. As the afternoon progressed, the weather turned. The sky curdled into a bruised grey, and a fierce wind whipped the sand into stinging clouds. Seeking shelter from the storm, Marianne and Christine decided to head back. Instead of the main road, they veered into the labyrinthine dunes to stay dry. It was a fatal decision. The dunes, usually a playground, transformed into a place of howling winds and hidden corners. It was here, amidst the undulating hills of sand, that their light-hearted walk collided with a predator whose malice was as sudden and devastating as the shifting summer gale. The towering mounds of sand acted as silent witnesses to the bleak, uncaring, and brutal summer tragedy. The struggle that ensued was a desperate, violent fight for survival. The girls were subjected to a level of savagery that stunned investigators. When their bodies were discovered the following morning, the scene was one of incomprehensible horror. They had been murdered with a ferocity that suggested a killer fueled by deep, chaotic rage. This was the act of a monster. The news rippled through the suburbs like a shockwave, shattering the illusion of safety that had defined post-war Australia. Parents began to look at the vast, open spaces with a new sense of dread. The back doors once left unlocked were suddenly bolted, and the innocence of a beach day was forever tainted by the blood left on the dunes. The investigation was one of the largest in history, yet it floundered in the shifting sand. Thousands were interviewed, and suspects included Australia's most infamous predators. Among them was Derek Percy, a man whose later crimes cemented his place as a disturbed individual. His history of violence against children made him a compelling person of interest, but the lack of physical evidence prevented a definitive link. Another shadow was the Duffy's Forest killer, yet each lead dissolved like a footprint in a storm. The police were hunting a ghost who moved through the dunes with terrifying familiarity. Forensic techniques of the era were simply not advanced enough to capture the traces left behind. As months turned into years, a specific detail from a witness report haunted the public. A person reported seeing a man running from the dunes shortly after the girls were last seen. He was described as having a wild-eyed, frantic look, escaping his own crumbling sanity. This wild-eyed man became the focal point of 1,000 theories, a spectre haunting the Sydney coastline. He was a figure of chaos in a world that desperately wanted justice. Despite the tireless efforts of detectives, his identity remained a silhouette against the horizon. The Wanda Beach murders became a permanent scar, a reminder that in the beautiful wilderness of the Australian coast, there are places where the wind howls louder. There, secrets are buried so deep in the sand they may never be found. The legacy of that day remains etched in the hearts of those who remember. The mystery of who he was and why he struck remains one of the darkest chapters in the annals of Australian crime. The three cases, the Beaumont children, the Somerton Man and Wanda Beach murders, form a haunting triptych of Australian Gothic history. They are more than just cold cases. They are cultural scars that define limits of the national psyche. In the decades following these tragedies, the collective identity of Australia underwent a profound, painful transformation. The sun-drenched beaches, once symbols of leisure and safety, became sites of vigilance and lurking shadows. The age of innocence did not end with a single event, but eroded under the weight of these unresolved mysteries. People realized that even in a land of vast horizons, there was nowhere to hide from cruelty of the unknown. Jim and Nancy Beaumont's home in Adelaide remained the ultimate monument to this frozen state of grief. The house served as a sanctuary for ghosts. Every piece of furniture, every toy, and every childhood book stayed where it had been on that fateful January morning in 1966. Jim and Nancy grew old in a residence designed for a young family, their lives dictated by the hope that the front door would one day swing open and three voices would fill the silence. They passed away without ever knowing what happened to Jane, Anna, and Grant, carrying their heartbreak to the grave. Their story is the emotional core of these mysteries, representing a generation of parents who learned to fear the very sunlight that had once felt so welcoming. This transition into a more guarded society changed the way Australians interacted with their landscape. The vastness of the outback and isolation of the coastline took on a more sinister character. These places seemed to conspire with the predators to keep their secrets. Red dust of the interior and shifting sands of Wanda Beach absorbed the evidence of crimes that should have been solved. There is a heavy, almost sentient silence that hangs over these locations, a reminder that the land itself remembers what the living have forgotten. This is the essence of the Australian Gothic, the tension between the bright modern surface of the country and the ancient dark mysteries buried just beneath the topsoil. In the 21st century, technology has begun to act as a bridge across this silence. The identification of Somerton Man as Carl Webb in 2022 was a watershed moment. It proved that no matter how much time passes, the physical world leaves a trail. Genetic genealogy is slowly peeling back the layers of these cold cases, one molecule of DNA at a time. Yet, as the mystery of Carl Webb's identity was solved, a deeper truth emerged. Identifying a man is not the same as understanding his motive. We now know his name, his profession, and his family tree, but we still do not know why he lay down on that beach to die with a secret code in his pocket. The names of the victims, Jane, Anna, Grant, Marianne, Christine, and Carl, are etched into history as much as the crimes themselves. They serve as a tribute to the lives interrupted and the families shattered by these events. While forensic science may eventually provide more names to the wild-eyed man of Wanda or the tall blonde man of Glenelg, the existential why behind their motives often remains buried in the shifting sand. As the sun sets over the southern coast, the tide continues to wash over the seawall at Somerton Beach, just as it did in 1948. It is a rhythmic, relentless cycle of arrival and departure. The question remains, for those left behind, is it better to have a name without answers, or a mystery that lives forever? Perhaps the true tragedy is not the lack of a solution, but the fact that some secrets are meant to be kept by the sea. The tide comes in, the footprints vanish, and Australia remains a land where the most disturbing stories are those that have no end, echoes that drift forever across an indifferent horizon,